It's late afternoon, 27th October, 1962, in the United States. The light is fading on Black Saturday. In Moscow, the clock has ticked past midnight. My great-grandfather, Nikita Khrushchev, has returned home late and is sitting down with his nighttime drink of tea and lemon. His day is not done. Just after 1 a.m., Khrushchev gets a phone call. Castro's message, the one written and rewritten the day before with the Soviet ambassador in Cuba, has arrived. The Cuban leader tries to warn Khrushchev of the impending American attack and pleads for a preemptive nuclear strike on the United States. Another telephone call comes soon afterwards. An American U-2 plane has been shot down. In his memoirs, Khrushchev will write, "Even a fool can start a war, and a wise man would find it difficult to bring that war to its end."
The Oval Office, around 7 p.m. President Kennedy has gathered his closest advisors. McGeorge Bundy, Robert McNamara, Dean Rusk, and his brother, Robert Kennedy. What they're talking about will remain secret for 25 years. The president has approved a response to Khrushchev's most recent message. The United States will lift the naval blockade, and it will not attack Cuba if the Soviet missiles are shut down. But he has not responded to Khrushchev's request on Saturday morning that American Jupiter missiles in Turkey be removed. Doing that could damage U.S. relations with Turkey and NATO, and there's no time left to negotiate. So in that classified meeting in the Oval Office, they decide that Robert Kennedy is going to convey a secret message in person to the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin. This message is not to be made public.
Selected members of the ExComm discussed, let's have Bobby tell the Soviets that we can't agree to it in writing, but if you remove your missiles from Cuba within 4 to 5 months, our missiles will be out of Turkey.
If the secret deal becomes public, it will be denied. This is the final American offer. Khrushchev has 24 hours to respond.
The Soviet missiles in Cuba for the American missiles, the obsolete missiles in Turkey. We're going to have that trade. It'll be secret. We can't acknowledge this publicly, but that's what we want to do. He has to hope that Khrushchev will respond favorably.
At 7:15 p.m., my father, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, summons the Soviet ambassador Dobrynin to his office at the Department of Justice.
When Nikita Khrushchev first met Fidel Castro in 1960 in Harlem, he'd seen him as a son, a communist son, a relationship that had begun with a bear hug in front of the press is about to be severely tested. The contents of Castro's alarming message to Khrushchev, calling him to strike the USA first, begin to sink in. It terrifies him.
Khrushchev does not want war. Khrushchev does not want a nuclear or thermonuclear confrontation with the United States, and he does not want to sacrifice the Soviet Union for Cuba.
Khrushchev's reaction to the message is revealed in a conversation 2 days later.
There's a very interesting conversation between Khrushchev and Novotny, the Czechoslovak leader, where he returns to this question of Castro, and he says something like, only somebody who's completely blinded by revolutionary passion could propose something like that, like a preemptive strike on the United States. So effectively, he thinks that Castro is gone crazy and that he could not be trusted.
Khrushchev says the following: Fidel Castro proposed that we ourselves should be the first to start an atomic war, Do you know what that would mean? That probably cannot even be expressed at all. We were completely aghast. Castro clearly has no idea about what thermonuclear war is. After all, if a war started, it would primarily be Cuba that would vanish from the face of the earth. What would we gain if we ourselves started a war? After all, millions of people would die.
As Sunday dawns in Moscow, it is clear to Khrushchev that the situation in Cuba is getting dangerously out of control.
Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin arrives at Robert Kennedy's office at the Department of Justice at 7:45 p.m. He immediately notices how tired my father looks, as if he hasn't slept for days. In his memoir of the crisis, 13 Days, my father describes this meeting. In that account, he does refer to the possibility of taking American missiles out of Turkey, but there's no mention of a secret deal. Robert Kennedy says he told Dobrynin that President Kennedy had been anxious to remove those missiles from Turkey and Italy for a long time. He'd ordered their removal some time ago, and it was our judgment that within a short time after the crisis was over, those missiles would be gone. But there are other accounts which reveal there was a clear verbal agreement.
You withdraw your missiles from Cuba, I promise, it's a verbal pledge, not a written pledge, that our missiles will be out of Turkey in 4 to 5 months. Robert Kennedy tells Dobrynin that Khrushchev could not say this publicly, and if he did, the U.S. agreement was canceled. And that agreement was censored when Robert Kennedy's 13 Days was posthumously published.
Theodore Sorensen, President Kennedy's speechwriter who edited the book after my father was killed, made sure to excise any mention of a direct promise over the missile swap. President Kennedy needs an answer the very next day, and Dobrynin fully understands that. But the communications available don't match the urgency of the situation.
They have to send a telegram back. They call Western Union. That's how crude the communications were. And they are watching the telegraph boy, as he was called then, get on his bicycle and ride off to his office to send the telegram. And they worry that he's going to stop and see his girlfriend or have a Coca-Cola or something. The communications were that crude between the United States and Soviet Union.
Chairman Khrushchev had initiated the crisis by breaking his word to President Kennedy. Now, the president hopes, but can only trust that Khrushchev will not reveal the deal. Some of those gathered in the White House think that Saturday evening might be their last meal. The Army, Navy, and Air Force are getting ready for what might follow if diplomacy fails. My father recalls we had not abandoned hope, but what hope there was rested with Khrushchev. The expectation was of a military confrontation the next morning.
Nova Ogareva, a country estate outside of Moscow. In the reception house, the Presidium gather at noon. Premier Khrushchev opens the discussion and does most of the talking during a highly charged meeting that will last most of the day. Khrushchev's aide, Oleg Trianovsky, recalls decades later that apart from a few comments from Anastas Mikoyan and Andrei Gromyko, the others are silent. The mood of the meeting, Trianovsky says, is, you got us into this mess, now you get us out of it. Khrushchev has received President Kennedy's official letter demanding the dismantling of the missile bases, but giving assurances that he won't invade Cuba. It offers Khrushchev a potential solution.
He sees how things have gone wrong on October 27th, and then his fear of war, he just thought that, perhaps humans are not as rational as you would want them to be. He decides that the gamble is not worth it. Nothing is worth a nuclear war, and he reasonably backs off.
As Khrushchev is telling his colleagues that he plans to dismantle the missile installations, there is a phone call. A coded telegram has arrived from Dobrynin, reporting what Robert Kennedy has told him in a private meeting, including the offer of a secret deal.
Time is running out. Khrushchev needs to agree to withdraw the missiles. My brother is under intense pressure to invade Cuba. And by some accounts, he says you only have 24 to 48 hours or something like that. Khrushchev would remember the message as even threatening, the military wants to take over from my brother in order to attack Cuba. And part of the warning is that if there's another shooting down of an American plane, then the U.S. will have to respond.
As the Presidium discussed the response, there is another phone call. Intelligence has come in. Kennedy is going to address the nation at 5 p.m. Moscow time, 9 a.m. in Washington. In the room, they wonder, is he going to announce an attack on the missiles in Cuba? Nikita Khrushchev moves fast. He needs to get a message to Kennedy before he begins his speech. Cable Dobrynin, he orders Gromyko, tell Robert Kennedy that Moscow is prepared to accept his brother's conditions and agrees to keep the Turkey discussions confidential. Khrushchev calls for a stenographer and dictates an official letter to the president. The foreign ministry in Moscow calls the U.S. embassy, telling them to expect an important message in 1.5 hours.
In Washington, it's early Sunday morning. I had promised my daughters for a long time that I would take them to the horse show, writes my father in 13 days. And I went to the Washington Armory to watch the horses jump. In any case, there was nothing I could do but wait. Across the river at the Pentagon, Robert McNamara and Maxwell Taylor get ready to meet with Curtis LeMay and the other Joint Chiefs of the military to prepare the strike on Cuba. It's scheduled for Tuesday, but Curtis LeMay thinks the operation should be brought forward. Tomorrow is the last day to attack before those missiles become operational, he's decided. President Kennedy is going to go to church, and he's preparing to make the short walk down Pennsylvania Avenue to Sunday Mass.
Diplomatic channels are too slow to get Khrushchev's letter through to Kennedy in time. They decide to use Radio Moscow to broadcast the essence of the message, but the studios are a 45-minute drive away. Soviet officials edit the letter and translate it into English. Copies are given to the Communist Party secretary in charge of ideology, Leonid Ilyich. He orders his chauffeur to drive as fast as he can to the Radio Moscow studios in the center of the city. Anatoly Gribkov, Soviet army chief and key architect of Operation Anadyr, would later recall the mood of the meeting that Sunday afternoon. Nuclear catastrophe was hanging by just a thread. We weren't counting days or hours, but minutes. Ilyich arrives at Radio Moscow in record time, his black limousine waved through by the militia. The text is handed to the chief announcer, Yuri Levitan. Levitan announced the start of the war with Nazi Germany in 1941, the death of Stalin in 1953, and Yuri Gagarin's spaceflight in 1961. At 5 p.m., he begins another historic broadcast. Говорит Москва. This is Moscow speaking.
You are tuned to Radio Moscow. In addition to instructions earlier transmitted to stop construction work on installations in Cuba, the Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
In Washington, President Kennedy is about to leave for Mass at St. Stephen the Martyr Catholic Church. There's a phone call. McGeorge Bundy tells him Khrushchev has accepted his proposal and is dismantling the missile sites. It's over. I feel like a new man now, the president says. The planned 9 a.m. television broadcast by President Kennedy that so frightened Moscow turns out to be a false alarm. In fact, it was just a scheduled repeat broadcast of his address on the crisis from the week before. My father, still at the Washington Armory Horse Show, is ushered to a landline for a phone call from Dean Rusk at 10 a.m. The Russians have agreed to withdraw the missiles from Cuba. I went immediately to the White House, he recalls, where Dobrynin visits him again an hour later. He told me that everything was going to work out satisfactorily, and that Mr. Khrushchev wanted to send his best wishes to the president and to me.
When Dobrynin writes his report for Moscow, he says it's the first time in weeks that he has seen Robert Kennedy smiling. Khrushchev's announcement is reported around the world to international relief, and to many he is seen as a peacemaker. But in Cuba, it's a different matter.
Castro hears about the deal that Khrushchev has made with Kennedy from Carlos Franchi, who is the editor of Revolucion newspaper. Carlos Franchi calls Castro, who was in a meeting with his other leadership, and he says, Fidel, I just heard the news over the wires. What's your response? And Fidel says, what news? And Carlos Franchi has to tell him then that he has found out through the international wires that Khrushchev has agreed to remove his missiles. And Castro is furious. He slams the telephone down and he kicks the wall and it breaks this giant mirror, and he swears and he feels ignored over the future of his own country.
Castro hasn't been consulted, and now he will not cooperate. He won't agree to let the United Nations inspect the dismantling of the missiles on his own territory, one of the conditions of the Khrushchev-Kennedy deal. He feels like a pawn. I've never seen him so dispirited, the Soviet ambassador Alexeyev reports back to Moscow.
He feels completely betrayed by his communist, allegedly comrade, who turned into a sort of imperialist patron who was making decisions about Cuba without even asking Cuban leadership what they thought about that. So his revolt is really a revolt against the new superpower that treats Cuba as its colony or semi-colony.
The Soviet troops who worked through tropical storms to construct the missile sites as fast as possible have to dismantle them at even greater speed. They begin the morning after the Khrushchev-Kennedy deal. They complete the job within a week. Khrushchev sends Anastas Mikoyan to Havana to try to calm Castro down and coax him to cooperate with American demands. When President Kennedy insists that Soviet bombers be removed along with the missiles, it's another sticking point for Castro. But he eventually gives in, and on November 20th, Kennedy announces that the naval blockade of Cuba will be lifted. American nuclear forces are taken off alert. Castro is reconciled with Khrushchev within a few months, touring the USSR in the early summer of 1963. The Cuban leader is keen to build bridges and desperate for economic aid.
So Khrushchev got what he wanted. American rockets withdrawn from Turkey, but it wasn't a public information. And Kennedy, of course, publicly was a victor in this because the Soviets withdrew their rockets from Cuba, and it was a big deal. It was done in the open. How was President Kennedy seen after the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved?
I think it was a really important outcome for President Kennedy. It was seen as a victory in the United States, and I think it strengthened his hand with the Senate and with the House. I think it put him in a better position to help gain passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the work that they were doing on that. And I think it was enormously helpful throughout the rest of his administration.
John F. Kennedy finds his position strengthened. The situation for Nikita Khrushchev is more complicated. My great-grandfather, too, claims it as a victory. The aim was to save Cuba, and he's done that. The missiles will be out of Turkey, but the world doesn't know that yet. Khrushchev's colleagues in the Presidium know all about the Turkey agreement, but they still don't see it as a win. It's something they use against him in 1964 when they oust him from power, exactly 2 years after the Soviet missiles were discovered in Cuba.
Towards the end of 13 Days, my father, Robert Kennedy, has a chapter called Some of the Things We Learned. The final lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he says, is the importance of placing ourselves in the other country's shoes.
One of the most important lessons that they learned was there was a need for quicker communications between Moscow and Washington, D.C.
That's the origin of the hotline. After that, the United States and the Soviet Union put in a special dedicated hotline between the Kremlin and Washington. It's actually a teletype machine, and that is an important step in calming down the Cold War.
A political relationship can grow out of a crisis. Kennedy and Khrushchev's letters chart that evolution, from Kennedy's election win in November 1960 to his assassination in Dallas 3 years later.
What's interesting to me is that when John F. Kennedy undertook an early campaign trip in the late summer, early fall of 1963, so just 2 months before his death, he traveled to the Mountain West. And he didn't expect that this would happen, but when he gave speeches in that part of the country, emphasizing the need for peace, people just went crazy.
I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth, peace.
The enthusiasm for this message was something that neither he nor his advisors expected, and I think it was an eye-opener for him. So that the American University speech, one of the great speeches in, I think, American political history, that he had given in June 10th, arguing for a new commitment on the part of the superpowers to a better relationship, had really resonated.
I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn.
So Khrushchev loved the speech so much.
So great.
That
That's so nice, isn't it?
in the universe of the Cold War, he published in Pravda the whole speech of the American president.
Amazing.
With no blackouts. It's just the whole speech that he did.
It's so thoughtful, and it just shows you that if you're willing to work for peace and have some humility going forward, you can make so much progress. President Kennedy announces in that June 1963 speech that the United States and the Soviet Union have resumed negotiations on a treaty banning nuclear weapons testing.
Just over a month later, on July 25, 1963, the two nations, along with Britain, agreed to ban nuclear testing in the atmosphere, in space, and underwater, but not underground. The partial test ban treaty is signed in Moscow in August.
Nikita Khrushchev summed up the crisis like this. The two most powerful nations had been squared off against each other, each with its finger on the button. John F. Kennedy also remarked, "It is insane that two men sitting on opposite sides of the world should be able to decide to bring an end to civilization." It was an extraordinary and terrifying standoff, and through it, the leaders of the two most powerful nations on Earth had come to see each other as human beings.
And America was becoming less of an adversary. And so in some ways, as drastic as Khrushchev's methods were, they seemed to have brought results. There were plans being made that President Kennedy would finally come and visit the Soviet Union. And my favorite story that my grandmother would tell me is that because Jacqueline Kennedy was the most elegant woman in the universe, my grandmother said they spent almost the whole year talking about this, of how they're going to be greeting Jacqueline Kennedy and how great they would look and how they would exchange fashion tips. And when they got the news that President Kennedy was killed, one of the daughters said, "Well, I guess Jacqueline Kennedy will never come to Moscow and would never exchange fashion tips," and she started crying.
That's a beautiful story. Thank you.
You didn't know it? You didn't hear it?
No.
That they were going to come and if this,
No,
the whole family was preparing.
It's so nice. So nice.
Grandmother was in love with Jackie, just absolutely in love.